Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's guest is an attorney and advisor who has served in senior positions under the Clinton administration. He's taught courses on public policy, law, and cybersecurity at the college level at places such as Syracuse University and the University of Maryland. His upcoming book is on the emerging ability of humans to genetically enhance and modify themselves. He calls this playing God, and today we're going to have a discussion about the existence of God, genetic engineering, and what the Bible has to say about these kinds of ethical issues. Our guest today is Robert Hausman. Robert, welcome to
Hey
the
Jerry,
show.
how are you?
I'm doing well. So we just corresponded like in the last couple of days, and so we wanted to go ahead and do this podcast. I always like to ask anyone who comes on, what am I missing in that introduction? What is it? Is that what you lead with when you're introducing yourself, or is there something else you like to talk about? Maybe it's family or something else.
You know, I have two kids. They're college age, and whenever anybody says, you know, what do you do? I'm a dad, right? So that's my proudest achievement. So I always lead with that. But other than all that you said, I'm also a practicing attorney, which is what pays the rent, and you got to pay the rent. So
Okay.
But beyond that, you nailed it.
Okay. So attorneys don't always have the best, or maybe there's a difference between attorney and lawyer. I don't know, but when people say lawyer, they don't really like that. Attorney sounds a little better to me. So what kind of law? Because there's all kinds of law.
So I have the weirdest law practice known to mankind. I swear this is the truth. On the one hand, I represent a couple of companies that are dealing with issues with the federal government, regulatory issues. On the other hand, I represent several recording artists in everything from contract disputes to claims against them. So I represent a couple of emerging artists, and I represent one guy who's a multi-platinum. So I have a really weird practice, and I'm happy about that. It makes it interesting on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. That's interesting. I came across something the other day. So I'm currently doing this in Nashville, Tennessee, but I live in Huntsville, Alabama, and in Tennessee, a law was passed earlier this year that prohibits people from using an artist's music in some kind of AI to do some kind of you can do some kind of deep fake of someone, and now that's against the law in Tennessee here. And so I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you are encountering, or is it maybe something else that you're doing with these
most of my
artists?
stuff. So it's funny, most of my stuff, a lot of my artists that I work with are country music artists. So I'm a fan of Nashville. I'm jealous of you being there right now. And but most of my stuff is like dealing with record labels and, you know, contracts and disputes about that. So I haven't gotten into the AI stuff with recording artists, but it's out there and it's a big issue for anybody who's creative. AI kind of goes at your bread and butter.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I don't know if I can ask ChatGPT like to give me legal advice or something like that, but it could probably, it's probably not going to be a great idea to do that.
I mean, I wouldn't put it up there on my top 10 list of things to do if I got sued, but you know, why not give it a whirl? Worst you can do is realize it wasn't the best idea.
Yeah. Now, I mean, when I see that you served in the Clinton administration, that's really interesting to be serving in the White House. What was that like? What were you doing? And I mean, if you can say, I don't know if it's
I can say. I did have some stuff that I worked on that was classified that I can't talk about, but for the most part, you know, I had a bunch of different jobs. I worked for a little while alongside the press office. I was for a while working as a consultant to the National Security Council. Then I went over to the drug czar's office. And then but the coolest thing I got to do, and this was like, so first of all, what was it like working in the White House? Amazing. It's an amazing experience. It's drinking from a fire hose every day. You never know what you're going to get hit with. But I think that the thing that was most amazing to me is every day when I would walk in, I would have this moment as I was walking onto the grounds where like your heart kind of skips a beat and you go, I work in this place. This is amazing. And also you have a sense of really profound responsibility that, and I think this has slipped a lot since I was there. At least I perceive it, and not in a good way. But I had a constant sense that I worked for the American people. Like the people were my boss. I had bosses along the way, like General McCaffrey, President Clinton, but ultimately, I worked for the American people, which being able to say that is a pretty cool thing. And so every day I felt like walking on sunshine. Even on my worst day, I could step back and go, wow, this is a great gig.
Yeah.
But the coolest thing I did get to do, and this is kind of the genesis of, no pun intended, this is the genesis of where this book comes from, was I worked on reform of the Olympics. And President Clinton tapped my boss, General McCaffrey, and we had already started working on doping, which is like, remember Mark McGuire, Sosa, use of steroids, pump up. And for a while, steroids and other things, going back to the Russians in the 70s, was just destroying sports. It was eroding the Olympics and other sports. And so we were already working on trying to reform the Olympics for doping and drug use. And then the Olympic bid scandals and all of that, the corruption came out. And President Clinton tapped us, my boss and I, and me on a day-to-day basis, to go fix the Olympics, which of everything I've ever done in my life will always be a standout that I got to play a role in kind of reforming the Olympics. So it was great. It was great. I miss it. I don't miss the hours. I don't miss the pressure of it. I do miss what we got to do.
Okay. Yeah. So you did that, and then again, you're an attorney. So I guess that maybe you've been an attorney throughout, and that's
Yep.
why you were in the White House with them. So you where I kind of first came in contact with you is you have this book that you're working on, and kind of in your first correspondence with me, you're saying that people are playing God, and you were referring to genetic engineering. Can you talk about what got you from being in the White House, doing this kind of stuff, to now you feel really strongly about we need to be looking closely at this genetic engineering thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in the middle of working on all this anti-doping, Olympic reform, and all of that. And we had set up this thing called the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is like the drug policeman, the doping and performance enhancement policeman for the Olympics worldwide. Brand new world organization, major accomplishment, all that. So I'm sitting at the first scientific meeting as part of the American delegation. And this guy gets up, a scientist, and he starts talking about, needing to stay ahead, that we're constantly playing whack-a-mole. We figure out a way to ban one drug and how to test for it. Boom. The dopers and the cheats go somewhere else, and they come up with a new drug, and now we're chasing them. So we're constantly playing whack-a-mole. And in that vein, he started talking about genetics. And I'm like, why are we talking about genetics, right? Because this is somebody who's super, super smart. I'm just a policy guy, right? This is a scientist, like massive PhDs, I think, Ivy League or whatever. And he's talking about doping, and he says, we are on the cusp of being able to genetically engineer athletes to be better and to win. And we have no way to control for it, no way to test for it, nothing we can do. And a light bulb went off in my head. So do you remember Michael Phelps, the swimmer? Mm-hmm. Amazing swimmer, right? So thing about Michael Phelps is, take nothing away from Phelps. He's an amazing athlete, set records for medals and all that. His training regimen is legendary. The guy's got drive. He's a phenomenal athlete. I don't mean to diminish him. Part of his success, though, was his physique, right? He had extraordinarily long arms vis-a-vis his body. The weight distribution in his body provided him greater buoyancy. The webbing in his fingers made him almost like a duck. He had all these physical advantages. And the thing is, in a sport where you're winning and losing Olympic gold based upon 100th of a second, do all those physical attributes add up to 100th of a second? I think probably yes. Again, that was natural. He did nothing about it other than be born with it, and he used it really, really well. So, street cred to Michael. But his physique played a big role in his success, right? So if you could genetically engineer your kid to have Michael Phelps attributes, would you give them an advantage in the pool? Absolutely, right? Could you take a kid who had all the other stuff, which is a lot, right? The drive, the desire, the competitiveness, the training, the long hours. If you could get your kid to have all that, plus have these physical advantages, you might have the next Michael Phelps. And I started thinking, wow, what does that mean for humankind that we could engineer you to be a better athlete? And then I started poking at that. And what I realized is it's not just athletics. And this is the scary part. It's also the great part, right? So double-edged sword, the promise and also the risk. Any attribute, we are at the stage, we are on the cusp of it. In fact, we're already inching into it. We are at the stage of going from being able to genetically fix things, right? So gene therapy, ALS, cystic fibrosis. There are a host of diseases that have genetic components where scientists are already using gene therapies to treat those people. Amazing. Wonderful. We are now at the stage where they can go from gene therapy, fixing flaws, to gene enhancement, meaning we can build a, air quotes, better person. And I'm careful about using the word better, but it's very subjective. Like better, some people want to be taller, some people want to be shorter, whatever. I don't care what you want to be. But, and it's not just physical attributes. Think of everything that goes into the makeup of a person that has a genetic component. And dare I say, pretty much everything has a genetic component. So your intelligence is, interestingly, one of the most genetically derived attributes of humans. Cognitive function, meaning the speed that you think out, the sharpness of your analytics, very genetically driven. Risk aversion. So like you want to build a soldier who's prepared to take the hill no matter the cost. We can genetically engineer, soon we will be able to genetically engineer you to be less risk adverse. Or a gambler. You want to be a great gambler? Yeah, we can make you a great gambler. So all these attributes, anything that's genetic or a genetic component, we are in the process of being able to either A, turn it on, B, turn it off, C, enhance it, or D, decrease it. So what does that mean for humankind? We can literally build, a Pierce Brosnan who is as smart as Stephen Hawking, who is, as tall and as athletic as MJ Jordan. Imagine what that looks like in the world. We will have gone from an era in which we have no control. You and I are just a bunch of genes that our parents threw together, to an era in which we will be able to control all these attributes and engineer, air quotes, the perfect person.
Okay. Yeah. So then that really brings up this idea of playing God, because again, if I'm a Christian, so I look at what the scripture has to say about how God makes each person unique. And what you're kind of saying is, well, what can happen is we can just create these people or choose this color eyes, this color hair, this height, these kinds of attributes, and be able to do the thing that God does in humans. And so you said that there was this doctor there that was saying that's what was coming. And that was back during the Clinton administration. Like, can you talk about how much is there opposition to this? Are people actually doing this stuff right now? And we just don't know about it. It's kind of like the cloning thing back a while back, where they were cloning and they just said, hey, here's something that's cloned. Is that what's happening now?
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. Like the worry was back during my era in government, and it's here, right? So there is a Chinese in a weird way, I don't think anybody knows what to do with it, right? So before we talk about, are people upset about it? What are people doing about it? And by the way, I love the way you led in with like, this is what God does, right? Because like, and I do think there's and we ought to talk about this. There's a big difference between fixing flaws, gene therapy, and gene enhancement. So put a pin in that.
Right.
And from a scriptural or faith-based perspective, that's a huge difference, like a massive difference. But to go at where are we at? So a year or two ago, I think it was, there was a Chinese scientist who genetically engineered two twins to have resistance to HIV/AIDS. That's enhancement, right? He found a gene that increases resistance to HIV/AIDS. He took two twins that didn't have that genetic capacity, and he implanted or engineered that capacity in them. This is here, right? There are, and in stages beyond that, so we can genetically engineer in several ways now. Well, the first is by screening and selection. So literally right now, you can go to a service and have them look at your genetic makeup and the genetic makeup of your spouse, and they will then analyze for IVF purposes, assisted reproduction technology, like which kid is likely to have a predisposition, which egg is likely to have a predisposition to cancer, which one is likely to have a predisposition to Lou Gehrig's disease, and they will select what embryo to implant to help you avoid diseases and things like that. This stuff is happening. We're just not talking about it. And also from a national security perspective, I mean, think about how many people are doing 23andMe, right? I want to know where I'm from. Boom, here's my genetics. That company is owned by a Chinese company. And the Chinese ownership company is aligned with under the Chinese military. China is using all the genetic material from all these Americans trying to find out, did I come from Thailand or did I come from Czechoslovakia? They're taking all that genetic material and banking it. They have a gene bank, the largest in the world, so that they can have a lead when we start engineering. It's insane. This is happening.
Wow. So yeah, so there this is already happening. It's not necessarily mainstream or things that people are talking about up front. And so you talked about that there's this difference between genetic, let's say, correction or
Therapy.
genetic therapy. So if someone has some kind of cancer gene that makes them more susceptible, that there might be a way for us to help mitigate that in some way, versus saying, okay, I want this child to be 6 feet tall with this color eyes and these color attributes. So that difference between those two, I guess the other question I have is any of this happening here, or is this kind of something that's happening in other places where they aren't wrestling with the ethics of all of this?
So I think let's break those into two parts, right? So let's first deal with the therapy versus enhancement. So, and since you're talking about scripture, let's go right to scripture, right? So you go to Genesis, the very beginning of the Bible. God made man in his image, right?
Right.
And we all assume, and I think it's a fair assumption, that if anything's going to be perfect, it would be God, right? So in effect, there is an argument there is a belief system among pretty much all the organized religions that God was essentially perfect and mankind was made in God's image. And set aside how we believe we got here, creation, primordial soup, all that stuff. Set all that aside. However we got here, when we got here, if we were made in God's image, we were perfect, or as close to perfect as we could get. And then along the way, like everything else, humans evolved. And in that evolving, errors were made, right? Think of it as like transcription. You're playing telephone, the game of telephone. You never get it exactly right. Somebody says, and you put in a the. So in all of us mating, having kids that's occurred since the dawn of humanity, some mistakes got made in the genetic transcription. And therefore, we got this disease, we got that disease, we have this and that. When gene therapy goes in and fixes those things, pretty much every organized religion right now says, well, that's getting us closer to God. God didn't intend those mistakes to sneak in. So let's fix, let's fix cystic fibrosis. Let's help that kid, hearing impairment, whatever it is. Let's fix that kid and get them closer, my God, to thee, right? Is the saying. And so that, I don't have a problem with it. I don't know. I haven't seen another religion that's come out and said, I have a problem with gene therapy, because it's kind of like, yeah, it's okay to fix things and get us back to where we should have been. When you talk about enhancement, that's not the case, right? Like you said, if you believe in faith, if you're a Christian or Muslim or whoever you are, God made you. And in that doing, God made those choices. You're going to be 6 feet tall. You're going to be 5 feet tall. You're going to be, blue-eyed. You're going to be brown-eyed, whatever it is. Now there's going to be a doctor sitting with parents saying, what do you want? It's like buying a car. You want red? You want blue? You want the leather interior? You want a 6 feet tall kid? How about the trigger for the NBA when your odds really go up to play in the NBA is 6'7"? What about 6'9"? 30%. That to me really does feel like, whether you call it in religious terms playing God or ethical terms, you're crossing a line, and it's a line we should be really careful and thoughtful how we cross.
Right. I mean, inherent in that is that there's an understanding of what the optimal or the ideal is, and instead of leaving that kind of thing up to God, right? So the idea that 6'9" is what you need to be, versus if God was going to make you 5'11", and whatever comes along with being 5'11", is where this is interesting, because if you have cystic fibrosis, we understand what the normal is that a normal person would have, and we can try to reverse and not have that disease. But this is going beyond that and saying, well, we think we know better than the way God made a person, and that becomes extremely problematic. Of course, that's the playing God that you're referring to here, and that's something that we would want to be really careful about when we're doing that. Are you able to still hear me? I'm not seeing your video here.
I hit an unstable connection for a minute, I think.
Okay, yeah, you're back. So yeah, I was just saying that that difference between God making these kinds of choices that people are now trying to make, kind of, there is an arrogance where you think, well, Rob, what would have been better about you is if you were a little shorter, or what would have been better is if you had a different body composition or had this much IQ versus that much IQ. But it is that combination. And I think we can somehow see these things as being imperfections when they really are not necessarily imperfections. It is just a uniqueness. And so I think what you were kind of getting at is there can then be this, I mean, everybody's going to want the 6'9" guy with that looks a certain way, and then what happens to that uniqueness now? I don't.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about.
Right. So first of all, you lose genetic diversity. I mean, we talk about the importance of genetic diversity in other species. Like when we lose species, genetic diversity is important. It maintains, the life on the planet. What if we lose human genetic diversity? That's a problem right there, right? Then you have what I call the Stephen Hawking dilemma. Hawking is was this brilliant scientist. He had neuromotor disease. which got progressively worse to the point that he couldn't communicate. He had to use like a special system to communicate, and was confined to a wheelchair and all this, severely disabled, but arguably the one of the brightest people ever to walk the planet. And if you listen to him himself and his mother talk about the fact that he had these limitations on the physical world, turned him inside and compelled him to occupy more time in his thoughts and to think bigger thoughts and be focused on that. And he has said, prior to his passing, he said that those physical limitations helped drive his genius. He wasn't arrogant, so he wouldn't have used genius, but I'm paraphrasing. But he himself said it drove his genius. So, okay, so we won't have another kid with those in the future. We probably will not have kids with those neuromuscular diseases. That's a great thing. No parent wants their kid to have that. On the other hand, do we lose the next Stephen Hawking? It's quite likely, yes, right? Because that kid who no longer has to sit and I'm not suggesting anyone should be confined to that life unless they want to be. But that kid who, is stuck in their wheelchair, can only think, now is out on the playground, now is like trying to become MJ or, Kobe, instead of trying to become Stephen Hawking.
Right.
It's a loss. It's a loss.
Yeah.
And beyond that, how are we going to treat each other? Right. This is the part that I really focus on, and I think is a huge issue for faith-based communities. Now you're going to have a component, I fear, and I think this is pretty much likely to happen. You're going to have a component of society that is bigger, faster, stronger, smarter, sharper, all those things rolled up into one. And then you're going to have a bunch of people who, because they lack the economic wherewithal to get engineered, or because they have faith-based concerns or organic concerns, their enviros, whatever, are not going to get engineered. And they're going to be at a significant disadvantage across society, not just sports, but academia, business, all of that. And how are the enhanced going to treat the unengineered, the native or organic? Our history is really crappy on this. Like, you look at the eugenics movement, you look at slavery, where white folks thought themselves better than black folks, and look what they did to them. We don't have a great history in terms of how we treat people who are different. And I very much worry, if we don't get ahead of this and really think it through, what will happen. And to me, thinking it through starts with faith and ethics and, philosophy.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the difficulties when people have associated atheism with science is that there's this idea that if you do science, you can't talk about faith at all. But if we don't have faith as a foundation to do science, then there's really no reason to say, well, why should I think twice? If I want to engineer people, I should just be able to engineer people, because there's nobody to tell me not to, or that type of thing. And what we're saying here is, no, that's how you get into these things like the eugenics movements of the past, like racially based slavery here in America and those kinds of things. And so if people were going to the scriptures, or if people understood that everybody's made in the image of God, which is one of those things that the book of Genesis says that we just gloss over, but that's not in all the religions. There are some that say something like it, but saying that everybody's made in the image of God really takes away this idea that you can say, I can subjugate you because you're different. And so with those people that are enhanced, I think I'd be curious to know what you think about the idea of potentially it being the opposite, that maybe the unenhanced, if the unenhanced remains the majority for a while, do the unenhanced somehow try to subjugate the enhanced, or do you only really see it in one direction?
So the thing is, the interesting aspect of it is the actual traits of enhancement right now, and I think for the foreseeable future, we can't pick you out, right? Like, I can't walk down the street and go, other than in the future looking at like, wow, that guy. Look at that guy. He's 6'9", he's buff, and he's brilliant. Something's got to be going on here. Okay, that's not a fair judgment statement, but I could try it that way subjectively, but it's not going to work. We don't have a way to pick you out. The fact is, even if the enhanced don't affirmatively subjugate people, like make it a policy, they're just going to do better on tests. They're just going to ace their SAT. They go to Harvard. The unenhanced don't. They're just going to do better in sports. They go to the NFL. The unenhanced don't. There's an inevitability to it. Do I think that there is a possibility of a backlash and a persecution of the enhanced? Sure. Yeah, we've done crazy stuff in this world, so why not, right? Could it be that people start coming down and going, no, that's unethical. No, that's this. But here's the thing. If you look at where we are in terms of competitiveness and advantage in our society today, nobody likes a cheater. We all hate cheaters. Yet, look at all the people that were involved in the college admissions scandal that we know of, let alone the one we don't know of, to get their kids into Harvard and whatever. Look at all the people who get doctors to prescribe ADHD drugs to sharpen their kids' focus when their kids don't have ADHD. Do we frown on that? Yes, we frown on that. Doesn't stop them, right? So given the fact it's hard to, point out the difference, I think it would be much more difficult for the unenhanced to persecute the enhanced. I think it's almost I think the question of how the enhanced treat the unenhanced is, where the rubber's going to meet the road.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because again, I'm trying to imagine there being things about being unenhanced that would be advantageous. Because again, being taller, stronger, faster, being smarter in whatever intelligence IQ. But when you look at something like what they call emotional intelligence, for instance, where you know the guy in high school that was really, really smart, smarter than everybody, but could never quite fit in. Is that kind of what could happen in the case of these enhanced people? Are there aspects of our unique humanity, our natural humanity, that can't quite be enhanced in that way?
I'm sure the answer is yes. I haven't really found it, right? So I've been looking for this, and I'd like to think it. I mean, my natural inclination is to say, of course, right? There's a certain uniqueness to humanity, and that's how I feel, right? But if I look at it from a data and analytics perspective, I have a hard time with it. So let me blow your mind. I can engineer. I don't know, what religion are you? Do you have reverends, pastors, priests? What
we have elders and deacons that are in the church, and preachers. So
okay.
we just
So now
really simple Christianity from the Bible. Yeah.
Now I know where you're coming from. So I can engineer the perfect preacher for you, theoretically speaking. So, for example, things you want in your preacher, you want them to be compassionate, right? There are genetic attributes to compassion. How about that? Kindness. There are genetic attributes to kindness. There are genes for kindness. There are also certain genes, we talk about the assassin gene, right? Things that make you more likely to be violent. We could turn those off, right? So that a preacher or a pastor always turns the other cheek, genetically speaking. So, yes, I want to believe that there are, the weird mix of genes that just happen. No, I do believe this. There is a weird mix of genes that turns out to be Lin-Manuel, who's going to write Hamilton and all that, and may not have been the in kid. I don't know his background that well, but may not have been the in kid in high school, but just, like, wow, boom. I think there will be examples of that. The question is, how many, how far apart, vis-a-vis the norm, right? Vis-a-vis this massive potential number, or even just large potential number. Because the other thing is, like I said, we actually can enhance your creativity, or we have the theoretical capability to do it.
So there's this other thing that you brought up about Stephen Hawking. So let's what about that part too, where we see so many people that do so well because of their adversity, and if this enhancement takes away much of that diversity, does that potentially hobble them or handicap them because you haven't had to go through adversity, and then when you don't have that adversity, now you are at a disadvantage with things, because I don't know if is there a genetic enhancement that gives you grit, or that gives you uh, this sense of I'm not going to quit, or those kinds of things that somehow that often come about through adversity, that probably isn't there if you are so enhanced in this way.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, I talk about your abilities need to be honed, right? And you know, if you're an athlete, you can be born with a great eye, and maybe you're a natural 3-point shooter or whatever your sport is, but it's what you do with that gift, right? You can squander that gift really easily. Don't show up on the court. Don't try a practice. Gift gone. Are there genes for example, mental resilience? Yeah, but the thing is, you don't hone those genes. Like, you're not rubbing them on the stone to sharpen them, right? So that adversity that Hawking went through, it definitely had an effect, and that may not be there. And isn't that the enormous twist of fate here, right? Like, in the search for perfection, we might actually be canceling out some of our greatest genius. And so on the one hand, if you took every person and made every person, genetically speaking, as smart as Stephen Hawking, imagine what the world would come up with. Imagine what the world would come up with. But on the other hand, if you took every person and genetically engineered them to be like Michael Jordan, no offense to Michael Jordan, I wish I had his skills and talent. Obviously, I use him as an example often. But you might undermine some of these other things, right? I think Jordan's a bad example because dude's crazy smart and has competitive drive like you read about, and has a business sense too. But you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess a lot of this gets back to this age old conversation about nature versus nurture, because that's kind of what we're getting at. And so the nature part is kind of the genetic part, where I think a lot of people put a great deal of emphasis on the genetic part, and rightfully so. And if those genetic advantages of IQ and that kind of thing can be made that much more, then that would be an advantage. But I think the nurture part is potentially what we're seeing here, that there may just naturally be a give and take between that God has put in the world, where even if you do enhance people in this way genetically, there are going to be disadvantages to that in terms of the adversity that they'll be able to go through, maybe in school, maybe in whatever it is that they do. Maybe they're outcast, we don't know. But I think one of the things about it is when you're looking at all of these, there is a sense in scripture that those who are believers are not as concerned or as worried as people in the world, and saying, well, we need to be working in the world and doing what's right, but knowing that God ultimately has control, and that it's not going to be something that arises that he is not able to deal with in the world, is something that is of comfort to people who believe the scriptures. And so in this case, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be putting safeguards on this stuff and really having these conversations, but at least we are saying it's not like so I'm a robotics engineer, so I talk a lot about AI and stuff, and people are really afraid of my uncle and aunt bought me, like, they said, have you seen Terminator, because you're like the guy on Terminator, and I still haven't seen it yet, but they bought me like the whole collection and said, you need to watch this. But people are afraid that some robot is going to go rogue, or some AI is going to go rogue and take over the world or something. And as a Christian, I just don't. God's not going to let something take over the world that he doesn't allow, or that he is not in control of. So there's a comfort there that believers have.
Yeah, I think it's well, I'm a first I'm gonna answer that, then I'm gonna blow your mind.
Right.
I think that humankind has a propensity to massively, if you're a person of faith and you believe in God and you believe in divine intervention and, divine plan, humankind has shown an enormous capacity to mess up that plan. And I worry because now there's no more nature. If we get to this point, and I think we're getting there, there's no nature, right? Nature is the random roll of the dice that produces you or produces me. No. It's now construction and nurture. And for other people, nature and nurture. And, it's a tough, if all the kids around little Jimmy, you wouldn't even know it was little Jimmy, but if you knew you were going to have a baby and all the other kids around it are engineered to be better and are going to do better in school and do better on the playground and do better in sport, that is a tough thing to ask a parent, not to enter that gene race. And so I fear that our better angels may get left by the wayside of our harsher realities. But in terms of AI, I'm going to blow your mind. We talked about before we came on the air about Henry Kissinger's new book, and you have to read it because the thing that he talks about, and this is the thing that pulls my thinking and Dr. Kissinger's thinking together, and we have a tie a long time ago when I was in the government, so I'm happy to be able to say that. Kissinger talks about genetic engineering in order to control the machine, right? So can we genetically engineer people to have a better capacity to control AI? And he talks about that as a potential response to the rise of sentient AI. Now imagine this, though. Imagine you take the smartest person you can engineer with all these great physical traits and everything like that, and you build them to be this genius and whatever, and then you give them a genetically engineered neural link to AI such that in addition to all their intelligence, they have all the books, all the reports, everything, all the data from all the world available to them in a thought. They don't need a brain chip or anything like that. They're as smart as they are, and they can access it all. That's kind of mind-blowing, right? To me, it is. So, no, I don't think the machines are coming for us. If anything, it's us coming for us.
Yeah. So you have the genetic enhancement along with having that access to AI. We see this in some ways where now that AI has gotten good enough to win, to basically beat anybody on the planet in chess, for example. Now the best chess grandmasters basically use AI to learn how to get better. So they are enhancing themselves by looking at these moves that nobody ever thought of before they had the AI. So we all are kind of improving in that sense. What you're saying, if you put on top of that the person who is genetically enhanced, then there's even more that can happen in that place.
And the scary part about that is, so a long time ago, do you remember there was I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I can't remember his name. There was a Black American fellow. He was, I believe he was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he did the TurboTax press the button. Doesn't take a nuclear physicist to tell you how to press the button guy. Brilliant dude, like insanely smart. Long story short, I had an opportunity to have about 20, 30-minute conversation with him. And we were talking about really, really cool guy. So we were talking about music. And he was telling me that he believed that the world's greatest album ever written was the Beatles' White Album. And he was too smart for me to debate him. I was just like, yeah, it's a great album. But we were then talking about AI. And I said to him, like, if all these things go by the wayside, like what are humans going to do? And he goes, go back to the White Album. What AI cannot do is that which it has never been thought of by man, because AI is man's creation, right? Its limits are what the inputs are and what you can derive from those inputs. So if you go back to the moment in time when I can't remember the painter's name, let's use Picasso. Go back to Picasso in the moment in time when Picasso goes, no, I'm going to turn everything into cubes. I'm going to turn everything into squares and put them together in weird squares. Cubism. No one had ever thought of cubism before. AI could never think about cubism on its own. It could have somebody could say, hey, make me a cubist Monet. But if cubism didn't exist AI couldn't come up with cubism because man hadn't thought of it. You could say, make me a geometrically originated, blah, blah, blah. AI can't on its own. It can think. I hazard it can't express human creativity. It can extend human creativity, but it can't be humanly creative. It defies logic. It just can't, even when sentient. So where's the divide? The divide in what people are best at is the creative, the unique, the human. And it's very difficult to imagine. Maybe somebody's going to dispute me and say, no, we have it. I'm sure they are thinking they do. I don't agree with that. Where the machine can be the human. But if you put the machine and the human together and they have both of those, they honestly, I believe they could, maybe even should rule the world.
Wow. Yeah. So it's interesting. You're talking about how the AI, and I agree with this. AI is not going to do what humans are doing in terms of creativity. But it's interesting that if you think about what genetic engineering is, there's a very similar sense here. It's one of the things that I think points to the existence of God. If people are looking for arguments for the existence of God, the fact that you have genetic code that we can move around and enhance, or we might call it enhancing, but we're basically modifying existing genetic code to be able to reliably say blue eyes here, 6'6" here. The fact that that's actually possible means that someone had to make the code that we are now modifying and enhancing. And so it's one of the things I think that just genetic code in general points to, there must be a God that made this, or that created this information that we can now enhance to say, okay, we can predictably make you this way or that way, is because that code was already in place that God made. I think is an interesting argument there.
The complexity of man, it is a very strong argument, I think, for those who want to find faith, including myself. I want to believe there's something bigger in this world than me, because Lord knows I'm not all that. But I want to believe, and when you look at like the complexity of man, that you can take these chromosomes and put them together in a relatively small number and come up with this entire planet of all sorts of different people, that is a pretty cool thing, right? And it does kind of make you scratch your head and go, well, how did that happen? And why didn't we all end up as newts, or toadstools? I do think that is a really compelling argument, a really interesting argument. But I always appeal to the folks that aren't that may not share my beliefs or my desires and things, and I talk about basic ethics, because I think a lot of our faiths and our beliefs all come down to some golden rules, right? And how we treat each other. And so I don't care if you have faith. Tell me how you want to treat other people. The other thing I will tell you about man and machine is I can prove to you that machines will never be able to do what humans can do, because there's no way a machine can hug somebody who's lost a loved one and be able to offer the compassion and empathy that is required in those moments. There's no way. Like a hunk of rubber can't do that, right? Maybe if you take a machine and design it out of it, it gets to some really gross conclusions. I don't want to go there, but
Right.
It can't happen. And I do think there are certain traits, because even if we can turn those traits up or down, it's still a human trait, right? Like compassion is still a human trait. I may be able to engineer you to be more compassionate, but it's still a building block, right? It doesn't change the fact that it was in you.
Yeah. I think there's the other thing I want to think about is this idea when we're talking about ethics. And again, I'm someone that believes that there really are things that are right and there really are things that are wrong. And that's why I think God puts a lot of that in us, so that most people agree on, yes, murder is wrong. Yes, rape is wrong. Yes, there's a way to treat people. So there are ethics we can all agree on. I think all of those come from God. But it's interesting to think about the the responsibility of, let's say, the enhanced person who potentially has parts of the brain that are, you said that there are these parts where you could potentially be more risk averse, or potentially not caring as much about others, or that kind of thing. I mean, there's a negative side to all of this. I would think that
Oh yeah.
we've talked about the enhancement in a good way, but what is the response? The interesting question for me when I'm thinking about sin, or if I'm thinking about God judging humans, what is the responsibility of the person who has been enhanced to be ruthless, to be a killer, or something like that? Uh, i- i- is that something that would be something that I'm really curious about? If someone can enhance you in some way where you now, it's almost like you don't have you don't have your mental faculties, right? It's like
Right.
someone who doesn't have all their mind. Um,
Yeah. So fancy way of put it, noblesse oblige, right? Or pop culture way, Spider-Man, great power, great responsibility, right? The hard part, I think, and this is the scary part, right? And it is not all wine and roses. I'm more worried than I am optimistic, quite frankly. Which it's unique for me because I'm usually really optimistic. But humankind has a very, very difficult time acting beneficently, acting with ethic, caring, when we start drawing lines, us versus them. When we see each other as one, we're pretty good about how we treat our neighbor, right? But when we start saying those folks, well, those are immigrants, they're bad people, right? Those are black people, they're bad people. Oh, he's a white guy. He's got to be X, Y, and Z. When we start drawing lines, we start treating people as enemies, not neighbors. And our history is such that all these bad things occurred because someone said they are not like us. How does Hitler come about? Hitler comes about because he says the Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals, all those, they're not like you Aryans. They're inferior, right? World War, that launches World War II, right? Slavery. The initial premise of slavery is that black people were inferior to white people, and therefore white folks were entitled to enslave them. Every single time we draw these lines and we treat people differently because some aspect we feel superior to them, rightly or wrongly, and I would argue wrongly. The problem with genetic engineering is now we create an us and a them, right? We create an engineered, brighter, smarter, faster, prettier, whatever, and those folks. And that when we start having that line, our society has shown a very bad track record.
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the way Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he's talking to a Jewish audience, and he's clearly, Jews and Samaritans, they were an us versus them, certainly. And he tells that to show, hey, that Samaritan is the one that helped out the Jewish guy, not the priest or not the Levite. It was the Samaritan. And so even when he asks the person he's telling the story to, hey, which one was a true neighbor? Which one was a neighbor to the man that got robbed? The guy doesn't even want to say the Samaritan. He just says, well, the one who helped him. And so
Right.
one of the teachings of Christ is that everybody comes from the same two people at the very beginning, Adam and Eve. We're all humans. We're all under God, and he wants us all to follow him. And so whether enhanced or not, there will be a need for people to understand that. And if you do understand that, then that us versus them is gone, and it's just all us, and all people that need to try to follow God.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't, I mean, amen. Right. I don't have anything
Yeah.
better to say.
Mhm.
The Bible is replete with, we're all in this together. We're all brothers, that's it. And that's the starting point, right? That's the treat others as you would treat yourself.
Right. Yeah. So, um, I wanted to. I'm trying to think if I've got any more questions regarding that. I want to talk a little bit about the book itself. We kind of talked about topic. I don't know how far you are into the book or when
I'm
you're
writing. I'm writing, and
you're
it's a
in the
painful process because the problem is it's kind of like this conversation. Like you've touched upon three other things. I'm like, I didn't talk about the Good Samaritan. I need to talk about the Good Samaritan, right? Because like every
right.
conversation I have around this touches something else for me, and now I'm like, how do I not do? I got to talk about that. So it's a process, and it's a great process, and it's a painful process all at once. So
Right.
and then I got to get a publisher. If there's a publisher listening is looking for a book about this, please call me. But it's a labor of love because it's something that I really feel a responsibility to talk about.
Okay. So again, there's not a tentative release date or anything like that. You're still in the writing stage. There's no title we need to be on the lookout for. You're
Oh, the
still
age
just
of enhancement. Look
the
look
age of
out for the age
enhancement.
of enhancement.
Okay.
And the thing is, like, this process takes so long. Reason why I was happy to go on your show is I want to start talking about this now because I worry that, like, while I'm writing, this is happening. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and if you don't raise awareness, if people aren't thinking about it, if we just stumble forward with this, we're just not going to be ready for it.
Right. Okay. All right. So I like to end every podcast with 4 kind of lightning round type questions. And so I'll give you those 4 that I give everyone else. The first one is, do you have a book that you're currently recommending to people? I know you mentioned the book by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt. Is that the one? Or is there something right now that you're like, hey, you got to check this book out, that I just came across? Or maybe it's
It's
a
got to
classic book.
be Kissinger and Eric Schmidt's book Genesis. It's a tour de force. It's like, and with everything going on with AI, I think everybody ought to read it. I mean, it's great.
Okay. All right. So, and the name of it is Genesis. Is
I
that
believe the
it?
name is Genesis. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Next question is, do you have an interesting quote or scripture that you'd like to share with us, that you maybe use or that's related to what we've been talking about?
Because of the way I'm thinking right now, I'm stuck on Genesis 1:27, which is,
Hmm.
man was made in the image of God. That
Yeah.
that quote from scripture right now, because I'm working in this and writing on this, just it's in my head a lot. And that's where I'm at
Yeah.
right
Yeah. I mean, it certainly relates to all of this and this idea of enhancement. God, that's what God, how God made people at the very beginning. So it goes right along with this. Do you have an unconventional belief? Is there something you believe that most other people don't?
now. That is when you said lightning round tough, this is a phenomenal question, by the way. Do I have an unconventional belief? I have a driving mantra that I don't know that most people share. And it is, if you're not shaking the tree, you're eating rotten apples off the ground. And
Okay.
because I really do believe that, like, we all have a responsibility to ourselves and everyone else to try to break outside the norms and think differently and push our own envelopes. And sometimes that's not comfortable, but I think we have to do it. So that's my thing. Shake the tree.
Yeah. Well, I think like with all of this, like I said, if I look at your profile, I know you've been doing podcasts, but like this new genetic engineering book is you're kind of shaking something that's not really the stuff that you had been doing previously. So that's
I'm beyond
you're
my comfort zone,
yeah,
and I'm
which
happy about it.
yeah, I mean that's probably another. It's not a conventional thing for people to intentionally go outside of their comfort zone, but uh, there's a lot of growth and a lot that's there in that place. All right, one more. You said you got 2 kids. What is a piece of wisdom that you would leave behind for your kids or for your family in general if you had to leave here? Hopefully not anytime soon.
My focus with my kids is around. It's a combination of a couple of things. One of is this notion of do the right thing when no one's looking, and help others. Like I am There are instances with both of my kids. Recently, I can't talk about because it was a private thing from my daughter helping a friend of hers through a tough time. And that left me enormously proud because she put herself out there. She took a risk to help someone else. And it's what I've always believed in. And it's kind of like how I've wanted to live my life. In my better moments, I've done that. And so to see my daughter do that, and my son's done a bunch of these things too, where like helping your fellow man, even if it hurts a bit or whatever, even if it's difficult, that to me is the highest calling, right? And so I've done my best, I think, to impart that on my kids. And now when I see them doing it, it makes me enormously proud.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to give you one final one on that.
Oh, one more. Okay.
Don't be deterred when you screw up. Make mistakes. Mistakes are growth in process. And I tell my kids, don't be afraid to screw up.
Yeah. Yeah. The mistakes are what's there on the way to whatever you're going towards. It's I think people talk about it being of you're not really losing, you're learning. And so that kind of attitude about messing up and making mistakes is you're on the way towards whatever that goal is. Okay. So if someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that? Is
best
it
way to
email?
get in touch with me is my email, Robert Hausman at msn.com.
Okay. So that's ROBERT HOUSMAN at msn.com.
Correct.
All right. That's the easiest way to get in touch with them. I think are you on LinkedIn as well? I think
I'm on LinkedIn.
Or do you check that at all?
Oh, all the time. And now I'm on Blue Sky. Meet me on Blue Sky. I'll tell you. Hold on a sec. I got to look up what I am on Blue Sky because
I'm not familiar with that.
I got off Twitter because it was just X because it was just too nasty. There was just too much negativity out there. So I'm at House 13. So at HOUSE 13 on Blue Sky. Come find me there.
Okay. So find him on Blue Sky. He's on LinkedIn. And then the email that we just gave, you can get in touch with him. I'm sure he would be happy to have conversations about genetic engineering, and it probably you might be able to help him with some ideas that are going to go into the new book. So really happy to have Rob on the show today. Any parting words for the audience before we get off of here?
No, Jerry, this has just been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. This was really good. So we'll be on the lookout for the age of enhancement. Maybe next year. We'll see. Hopefully next year. He's writing. Get him a publisher, and he'll maybe have that out for us next year. We'll be looking forward to that. That's it for today's show. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Have a great day.